All right, so next, I'm very pleased to welcome our featured speaker tonight, Phil Angel. Phil is going to talk to us about residential renewable energy. And just to give you a little background about Phil, he is a seasoned solar designer certified through the North American Board of Certified Energy Practitioners, but he's worn many hats in his varied work life. He's been a public school science teacher, a USDA soil scientist, a Tai Chi instructor as well. He's a licensed builder and realtor and has spent most of his life as a remodeling contractor with training in Passive House, a system designed to create the most efficient homes built today. In 2014, Phil completed work on his own new home on Great Herring Pond in Plymouth. And it was during the process of putting on solar panels that he realized that he may have discovered his new vocation. This path has led to his work today as a designer and solar consultant at Sunbug, where he specializes in new construction. Phil is also active with Citizens Climate Lobby, is vice president of the Herring Ponds Watershed Association, and was a founding member of the Marshfield Energy Committee. He speaks tonight as a proponent of alternative energy and sustainability. Welcome, Phil.
Thank you very much, Holly. It's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate you asking and giving me the opportunity to speak. And it's been an inspiring meeting so far. These folks who have spoken so far are a tough act to follow, though. So I'll do my best. Got a lot of information for you today. Holly shared with me a slideshow from Clean Energy Center, the CEC, and that's what I'm going to be working with, and leave time at the end. There'll be plenty of time for questions. So if you do have questions, jot them down or make note, and hopefully either they'll be answered during the show, the slideshow, or else we'll get to them afterwards.
Oh, and I wanted to add, if you want to use the chat feature to enter your questions, that would be fine as well. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Okay, Phil, do you want to? Okay, good. Everybody else is good at screen sharing. Glad to see it.
Okay, so as I said, I can't take credit for the slides. I like most of them. A few of them I'm going to make some comments on that I think could have been better, but it's really a pretty good slideshow. And I guess my buttons don't work when I'm there. Here's what we're going to go over: is some of the PV basics, where projects are trending, how you can get solar on your own roof or in your own yard. How it works from a physics point of view a little bit, and cover some of the incentives. To start with, panels come in a lot of different sizes and shapes and flavors and ways to mount them. So these panels in the bottom left here, this is called a portrait style installation versus a landscape style over here. These particular panels would be called a white backsheet with a silver or a white frame. These panels over here are black on black. They're a black frame, black back sheet. You don't see the circuitry inside. So a lot of people really prefer the look of black on black, and they tend to be just slightly less power output than these panels over here. For instance, when I design, I usually start with an LG 380, or if they want black on black, it's an LG 370 for the same family of panels. Generally, roofs are the most popular because it's the most economical. It gets the panels up higher and further away from the trees. You can see every single one of these houses has some shading issues. That's not always possible. This array right here, these are actually 2-axis trackers. And so these will follow the sun. They'll tilt toward the sun and they'll rotate toward the sun. And then at the end of the day, they'll turn vertical and spin back to the east and wait for the sun to come up again. And they produce a lot more electricity, maybe 60% more electricity, but they're very expensive. And one photo that's really missing here is a standard ground mount, which you've probably all seen. It's usually a rack of maybe 4 tall and 12 wide, or whatever you happen to need. And they're less expensive than these trackers, and they can be mounted in a field or a large yard, but they are ground level, so they have to be even further from the trees. So this is just a little review of how we acquire energy and how much energy we need, and what some of the various sources of energy are. And you can see there's still a lot of uranium in the ground. Hope it stays there. Natural gas, all the old favorites. But where is solar? Where does it stand? Does it even show up? Well, it does. It turns out there's quite a bit of solar power available. So we are just being absolutely flooded with solar power. And Thomas Edison was one of the first big proponents of solar power. And in fact, it looked like we were going solar back then. He invested a lot in solar hot water. And it was just before oil was discovered in Titusville, Pennsylvania. So things changed a little bit after that. So where is it best to put solar? Are you in a good place for solar? This map shows the orange color is the brightest, the most. You all can see my cursor, I hope. Maybe you can let me know if not. Orange is the really highest amount of solar insolation that's being received. Green's a little bit less, and then you get into blues and the purples, and then that's by far the less. So you would expect Utah, New Mexico, Nevada, and Southern California to be absolutely leading the pack, and they're not. It's Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Jersey, Rhode Island, and Oregon. And they're all dwarfed by Germany. Germany has the most solar per capita in the world. So it's not a function of how much the sun shines. It's much more a function of cultural issues in that town, or rather that state or that region. Incentives that are available, which is part of the cultural background, and also the price of electricity. In Florida, people might pay 9 cents for electricity, and we're paying 23. So expensive electricity makes a big difference too. So you can see that the price of electricity has been increasing over the years. It's actually a little more of a sawtooth pattern, because it always goes up a little bit on December 1st, and it goes down a little bit on June 1st, and then up a little more and down a little bit. The trend line, though, is always going up. As some of you probably know, that we pay for a few features in electricity. It's until recently, it was about half of the cost for generation at the power plant and about half for delivery. More recently, it's more like 55 or 60% for delivery, probably because it's being delivered from further. Pilgrim is closed, Brayton Point and Fall River is closed. The plan now is to bring electricity from Quebec, because we just aren't generating enough here. So the transmission is really a big factor. A lot of electricity is wasted in transmission, and it's very expensive. And our infrastructure is really not in the greatest shape. A lot of it's still analog technology. And they always have to try to keep it sized for the maximum demand. So solar really took off here in 13, 14, 15, and that around that area. And this is a solar price, and the price per panel, the price per watt dropped precipitously during that time. They're showing right here at $3.80. That's a per watt price, and that's a really good number to use for comparison between different solar proposals. If you're shopping for solar, is how much it is per watt. There's some other factors too, but that does cut through some of the other more confusing details, like the size of the panels, the size of the array, the output, how much is it per watt. So solar really did take off. I think it's the next slide that illustrates that. This is the distribution of hippies in 2005. These are the really early adopters, the pre-adopters. 2015, these are the early adopters. And last year, it's just growing and growing and growing. So I think we've reached the tipping point where people kind of expect to see solar on certain roofs. If they're really sunny and they're a good direction, why wouldn't you put solar on it? And it's so I think it's much more acceptable now. There's a number of ways that you can go solar, that you can get solar panels on your roof. Outright purchase by far is the most common method these days. Earlier in 12, 13, 14, in that time frame, leases and power purchase agreements were a little more popular. They're never quite as desirable financially for the end user, as long as the end user can somehow either purchase the system outright or find a way to finance it. They're always going to do better than a power purchase agreement or a lease, because there's nobody else who is taking advantage of the solar array, only you. The exception to that is if you are a nonprofit if you're a church, for instance, you don't have any tax appetite, and so you can't take advantage of the tax credit. So you might be better off with a lease or a power purchase agreement. And also, if you are in the category where you don't have much tax liability, and maybe you have rental income, you write off income, or you're on a fixed income and you just don't pay federal taxes, it's not a refundable tax credit that's available for solar. So you really do need to have the tax appetite. I'm not going to go over all this because I think they kind of overcomplicated it a little bit. The bottom line is direct ownership is better for the homeowner, because that's all the incentive programs were designed to be taken advantage of by the homeowner. And then some very clever solar companies found a way to market it. So the panels don't have any moving parts. The silicon on the front and back are doped with different elements, so that they're both photosensitive, but they respond differently. One attracts electrons and one repels electrons in the presence of light. And the thing that's a little bit off about this diagram is that these electrons that you see that are released by the sunlight hitting the solar panel here, they don't really go straight over to the other side of your panel, because they wouldn't do any good if they did. So what they really do is they go into a circuit, they go into a wire, and then through an inverter, and then into your main sub panel, and then they go down the circuit wire and they power your washing machine for a while, and then come back, and on the return trip they come to the back side of your panel. So you put all of your electrical loads between the front and the back of your panel through the wiring and the circuitry. So that's really more how it works. A little bit of nomenclature. The little pieces that go into making the array are called cells. The cells go into a module. These solar modules are generally around 40 by 68 inches. And the modules all put together either in landscape or in portrait or an array. Quite often you'd have several arrays on one roof. They'd all be considered the same array. The solar panels themselves make DC electricity, the same kind of electricity you get out of a battery. But when you plug something into the wall, you're plugging into an AC system. So you have to get this DC electricity converted to AC electricity. And there's a couple of ways to do that. This is a central inverter, and it's about maybe 20 inches by 30 inches. And it's fan cooled. It goes often on the outside of the house. And the way that would work is that the wire, the circuits from the roof would be fed down into that inverter, and they'd come down and be fed in as DC, but they'd come out as AC. And then the other alternative, and the one that I prefer, is that each panel has its own inverter. It's a micro inverter system. These little micro inverters are much more rugged than the central inverter. They hide behind the panel. So the electricity coming off the roof is AC, which presents some other advantages. It's easier to run AC than DC, as Thomas Edison found out. I think the microinverter is far superior because the panels operate more independently. And also they're designed to last for 25 years. They have a 25-year warranty versus a 12-year warranty with a central inverter. So that's another thing to look for if you are if you're shopping for solar. That's definitely a conversation you want to have. Are you using microinverters or central inverters? And the central inverter generally is a little bit less expensive initially, but you need to plan 12 years down the road on replacing it. So there probably isn't a whole lot of difference if you figure it that way. So the sun strikes the panels make electricity. The electricity comes off the roof. Either it's converted through the microinverters to AC on the roof, or it comes off the roof and gets converted through a central inverter. Its next stop, and maybe that's what this is, I'm not sure, they didn't really label it. Its next stop is that you'd really need a revenue meter, because you do get a financial gain from making solar electricity. It's a premium product, and people buy the credits for it. They buy the certificates for green electricity. And that's one of the ways solar arrays get paid back. So you do need to have a revenue meter. But basically the electricity, when the sun's shining, the electricity comes off. If your TV is on, your lights are on, your washer is on, and so forth, the electricity will flow through your main service panel, and it'll supply all of your needs. Sometimes you're not going to be home. The solar panels are producing electricity, so it doesn't get pulled out through the main service panel, so it goes out through your meter. which when you go solar, gets changed to a net meter. So it runs in both directions. And then from the net meter, it would go back out onto the grid. So the net meter would keep track of how much electricity went out onto the grid. And we have a net metering program in Massachusetts that is really excellent. And basically what it means is when you produce electricity and it goes out through your meter, you get it back at pretty much the same price. So you can make electricity all day when you're not home and it goes out through your meter, and then you come back at night and the meter runs backwards and you use up that electricity and end up, breaking even by morning. This is the revenue meter that they left out of the photo. There's a couple of devices that are going to need to be on the outside of the house with solar. You always need an AC disconnect. It's a rapid shutdown or a manual shutdown, really. And you generally need a revenue meter, depending on whether or not you're in the SMART program. And then also on the outside, you might have a central inverter, or you might have a combiner box if you're using Enphase microinverters. Now, we have some other utilities in Massachusetts. We have a lot of utilities in Massachusetts besides Eversource and National Grid. There's a lot of private light companies or municipal light companies. Lakeville has one, Hingham has one, Hull has one, Belmont has one. There's a ton of them. And they operate under completely different set of rules from the public utilities, which are supervised by the utility board. So if anybody's listening and they're in one of these municipal locations, you really won't have an option of a lease or a power purchase agreement. You would have to purchase your system, and you'd want to make sure that whoever you were working with was very familiar with the regulations of that municipal power plant, because they're quite different. So a little bit more nomenclature. I'm sure you've all heard of watts and kilowatts. Your system size, as I said, the panels that I often use for design, initially I'll start with a 370 or 380. We have some higher power, some lower power. So it's 380 watts. And if you put 10 of those panels together, you would have 3,800 watts, which would be 3.8 kilowatts. A lot of times when somebody has a solar array, that's how they'll describe it. What have you got? Well, I've got a 6.2 or 6.2 kW or 6.2 K. They all mean 6.2 kilowatts or 6,200 watts. And we don't use megawatts in residential. Now, the part where it gets a little confusing is when we use electricity, we use kilowatt hours, not kilowatts. So it's important for your solar designer to know how many kilowatt hours your system is going to produce. Kilowatt hours are what you get billed for from Eversource. Most of you listening will be on Eversource, and they're about 23 cents a piece. This electric bill is not really that helpful. It's either somebody who is on vacation or they have solar and is disconnected, or I'm not really sure what. If you look at your electric bill, you will see these bars representing your usage, your average usage per day for the previous 13 months. If you look a little further in your electric bill, you'll see a little square box that has the months listed and exactly how many kilowatt hours you used in that month. And so you can eliminate one of them because it's 13 months. And you can add up all those kilowatt hours and see what your usage is. So that's one of the steps in designing a solar array, is find out what the customers used in the past year and then have a conversation. Are you going to be adding anything? Are you getting an electric vehicle or a hot tub or a heat pump? Are you removing anything? Or, is kids going to college or something like that? So based on all that, you would come up with a target for production. And the average home is around 7,000 to 8,000 kilowatt hours. I've seen homes 50,000 kilowatt hours. I've seen homes 3,000 kilowatt hours. So it's really not by size of the home. It's really more by your individual habits and the efficiency of the equipment that you're running. So this says the panels really should have southern exposure, and we've found that that's not necessarily the case. We found that an unshaded east or west facing roof is perfectly good for solar in Massachusetts because our incentives are so good. A south facing roof is even better, but shading is quite important. The angle also is not that restrictive. We put solar on flat roofs at a 5-degree pitch. We put them on 45, even as steep as 60 degree. And again, you don't need optimal production. You don't have to have a perfect site in Massachusetts because we have such expensive electricity and such good incentives that the payoff time is still good for even for a mediocre site. One thing that we're limited by sometimes is open roof areas. There's dormers or hips or chimneys or vents. That's all got to be taken into account, and they all provide their own little bit of shading as well. Shading is important because you don't have to shade the whole solar panel to shut it down. You just have to shade a little bit of it, and it completely turns off the production for that solar panel. Microinverters help with that because each panel is acting independently. But if you had 12 panels strung together and you didn't have a microinverter, or they didn't have microinverters and they didn't have optimizers, then all 12 panels would be dragged down to the production of that lowest panel. So the design's really important. You need to either have optimizers or microinverters, and you really need to take into account shade. This is kind of an old school tool. We still use them. You climb up on the roof with this tool. It's a little handheld device. It's got a little bubble-shaped camera, and you hold it south. It's got a little built-in compass. You hold it south, you hold it level, and you take a picture or a couple of pictures on the roof. And you can see that it shows you on the right-hand side there's some trees, and it kind of shades them in green. And then it's got the months of the year in those paths. That's the path of the sun. And it also has a little computer chip inside so that it takes this information and it generates the annual production. It looks at every single day of the year and every single tree and generates your annual production. And the number that you're really looking for, the performance number, is called the TSRF, Total Solar Resource Factor. And it's a number from 1 to 100, and we never see 100. Once in a great while, we see somebody in the low 90s. If you were east facing and had no shading, you'd have an 80. West facing, same thing. So you can sort of use that, and you could ask for that if you're working with somebody. What's my TSRF? And that'll kind of give you an idea of the quality of your site. The higher the TSRF, the faster your payback will be, because you'll produce more electricity, you'll need less panels, and so forth. The barriers that prevent people from going solar, I'm anticipating that we're going to be talking about those more during the question and answer section. So I'm not really going to go into this too much because it's very individual. With solar, you really have to approach every house as an individual, because it's the needs of the people are different, and the design is going to be different, and the barriers are going to be different. So right now, there's state and federal tax incentives. There's a SMART program, and of course, there's the avoided cost of electricity you don't have to pay for. The tax credits are just that. They're tax credits, not tax deductions. So that's something you want to bear in mind. The difference is that if it's a tax deduction, let's say it's a $8,000 tax deduction, then that just comes off your income, and you'll pay tax on $8,000 less in income. If it's a tax credit, that's like a check made out to the IRS. And if you owed $8,000 in taxes, that would cover it. And anything you put in, you'd get back. So a tax credit, as long as you have that tax appetite, is a dollar for dollar value. And the tax credit right now is 26%, and it's $1,000 for the state. That is actually subject to change in the Build Back Better plan. It's possible it's going to go up to 30. It's possible the Build Back Better plan won't pass. Who knows? But if it does pass, then it'll probably go from 26 to 30, and it won't sunset for 5 more years. So that's what we're hoping, because that's a big driver for solar. The Massachusetts tax credit, everybody gets $1,000. The 15% you can just disregard, because it always works out to $1,000. You don't pay sales tax on the panels or the inverter or the wire or the harnesses or the meters or anything else, because that's another incentive. If your solar array is worth $30,000, the town cannot assess you that extra $30,000 and charge you property tax on it. That's another one of the incentives. So net metering is kind of key to where solar will and won't work. And that's one of the things that is different with the municipal sites, the municipal plants. Some of them have good net metering laws and some don't. But I'm going to explain net metering, how it works at my house. And I think that would be the easiest way to understand it. We have 20 panels. And when we moved in, we didn't have an electric bill yet, so we didn't know how much electricity we were going to use. And happily, we were very accurate, at least initially. We added a little bit of a load sense, but initially we were producing like 6,500 kilowatt hours and using 6,500 kilowatt hours. So all summer long, we overproduce because the sun just beats down on those panels and we don't use, the lights aren't on as much. We didn't use much air conditioning. So by September, let's say, we have a negative electric bill because we've produced more electricity than we could consume. So we have a negative electric bill of maybe $260. And then October, November, maybe it's down to $220, and December maybe down to $170, and January down to $150. And by the time April rolls around, it's just about zero. And then in May, maybe it's negative 10, June, maybe negative 50, and it builds back up to another negative number. So that's the net metering law. You make the electricity and you own it. It shows up as a dollar credit, not as a kilowatt credit. It doesn't ever expire, but it's also not redeemable for cash. At least it's not supposed to be. So you really need to plan to be able to use that electricity at some point. It's okay to oversize a system if you know you're going to be getting heat pumps or you're going to be getting a plug-in car, because they both use a lot of electricity. But you don't want to oversize just for the sake of oversizing, because you won't get all the value out of your array. The SMART program, the CEC that put the slide deck together is very involved in the SMART program, and they went really kind of hog wild with SMART information. So I'm going to really pare that down for you, because SMART gets complicated even for us who deal with it every day. If you're in Eversource territory, which, as I said, most of you are, the SMART program means that if you put solar on your house, then you will get paid about 6.5 cents for every kilowatt hour you produce for 10 years. So you might produce, 6, 8, 10,000 kilowatt hours. So you might get, $400, $500, $600 per year for 10 years. So that helps pay down the system. In National Grid, it's about 2 cents. It's much lower in National Grid. And if you don't qualify for either, or if you've already had your 10 years, then you can change to the REC program, the Renewable Energy Certificate program, and that's about 3 cents. And that doesn't have an expiration. So you get 3 cents for basically forever. So some of you probably noticed that that's even higher than the National Grid rate, because the SMART program is been around for a while. It's a step down program. Each step is a little bit lower than the last one, and the National Grid program is down to 2 cents now. So unless you're getting a battery, you would go with a REC program instead of National Grid, because you get 3 cents with REC. So why did I bring batteries into the conversation? The SMART program is kind of cool in that it has some adders and some things that they wanted to incentivize. They custom designed it because they wanted more batteries. They wanted more carports. They wanted solar built on landfills and things like that. So they incentivized them. They added adders. So if you were to put in a storage unit, a battery storage unit, it's a sort of an exact calculation, but it works out to 3.5 or 4 cents. Let's say 4 cents per kilowatt hour. So in Eversource, you'd go from 6.5 to 10.5 cents. In National Grid, you'd go from 2 cents to 6 cents, which is better than the REC now. So the batteries, which aren't really discussed too much in the slide deck, have a number of incentives, and just like the solar does. You qualify for the tax credit as long as it's hooked up to solar. You don't get the Massachusetts tax credit again. You get the federal tax credit. You get this bump in the SMART program if you're in the SMART program. No matter where you are in it. And you can choose to share your battery with your utility, and they will send a message to your battery on days where there's a really peak demand, and they'll tell your battery to discharge. And if you don't use the electricity, it'll go out through your net meter. You'll get credit for it, so you won't get beat up on that. But that pays $200 to $500 a year, and that's distributed storage. And some of you have probably heard the term smart grid. Well, that is the smart grid. That's the smart grid. It's in Linda Lancaster's basement. She has a battery in her basement, and she signed up for the program. And And when there's a call, then her battery depletes. She wouldn't probably even know unless she got a text, and then it just fills back up the next day. And the reason for this is because it's really the peak load that keeps the grid maintainers up at night. You know, they have to design a system to cover the peak load, or else they get brownouts. So they drive the peak load by they drive the peak load down by incentivizing batteries. And in some places, they charge you more during peak hours. In California, they charge 2 or 3 times as much during peak hours. If that comes to pass in Massachusetts, that's another benefit for batteries, because you can set them up to discharge into your home during those peak hours so that you never pay that premium for electricity. This is sort of the insider news about the SMART program that you always wanted to know. All this is basically telling you that, yep, you get an extra 4 cents if you have a battery. And it's a pretty complicated process to go through the exact dollar amount and so forth, but as I said, it's about 6.5 cents, and you get an extra 4 cents. We discussed this already, that there is an exemption on property tax. That's if it's your primary home. So if it's not your primary home, you'd have to actually, let's see. I don't think you're assessed on your property tax. I'd have to double check that. But you do pay sales tax if it's not your primary home. So you pay a little bit more for the system. But you still get the tax credit if it's not your primary home. Home insurance, solar doesn't really present a special risk. It's not like getting a trampoline that's going to, you know, give your insurance company pause. It might increase your policy by $20 or something like that. It also increases the value of your home. So if you do have solar on your home, I would, and you're going to get it appraised, I'd recommend looking for a green appraiser, because they're specially trained in how to evaluate solar and also other high performance features of your home, like extra insulation. And there's a worksheet in which you can calculate the exact amount. But what it boils down to is that basically, if you paid about $30,000 for your solar array, then that's going to increase the value of your house by about $30,000. And it's going to be depreciated over 20 years. So maybe if you sold your house in 10 years, the added value would be $15,000. That's painting it in very broad strokes, but the appraisers do have a tool with which to increase the value of your home with solar. So we talked about a lot of the options of the design. Financing options we haven't really talked about too much. There used to be a solar loan. Some of you might have heard of that. The solar loan was fully used and is no longer available. All the money is gone. I always tell people probably the best option for financing solar is a home equity line, because you just can't find cheaper money or more flexible terms with a home equity line. You can pay interest only. You know, you pay 2% interest or whatever it is now. And when you get a loan from, let's say, Clean Energy Center, or not Clean Energy Center, we have a Clean Energy Credit Union that we use, and they're about 5.9. So it's never quite as good as when it's secured against your own home. So I hope I've covered what you wondered about solar. I'm sure there's going to be some other questions too. And I apologize for this information dump. There's a lot to discuss, and I know it's confusing because I've been confused by it myself. But I would be happy to take some questions now, if I can find a way to stop sharing. There we go.
Well, I don't see any questions in the chat, and thank you. That was an excellent presentation, Phil, and it certainly addressed a lot of my questions. Does anyone in the audience have questions for Phil?
I actually have a couple, but I know that we also need to have an announcement about a couple upcoming meetings, so I'll make it super quick. My questions were, can the sun trackers be mounted on roofs?
They probably could, but they have a lot of, think of it as a big sail. They have a lot of area to catch the wind. So when we mount them in the ground, either they're a whole cement truck worth of concrete for a footing, or they're these things called earth screws that have like a 5,000 pound pull out force. So it would be some difficult engineering to mount it on your roof.
Okay, thank you. Andrea just shared one in the chat. Do you want to just speak, Andrea?
Or I can speak. I was just wondering what the most common or one of the most common barriers to residential solar is, because I know for me, I've been like on the fence for a while.
Mhm.
There's so many barriers. I just didn't know what in your experience was the most common.
I would say that there's a number of them that are common, but I would say the most common is that, you know, it's a challenge to come up with that cash instead of just paying your electric bill for $200. You know, what do you mean $28,000? You know, so it really takes some thoughtfulness and an open mind to actually look at the cost and how you recoup that cost, and some faith. So I would say that that's the biggest barrier is and I think they called it inertia, which I think is a good term for it, because let's face it, most of us can pony up the electric bill every month, and a lot of people think, boy, that's a great idea. I'm going to do that someday, but it is a little bit of a mountain to climb to get to the point where you're ready to take the plunge. And all the people who do it, I give them a lot of credit. You know, I knew I wanted solar panels, so it wasn't that hard for me. But when you're weighing the plus and minuses, or you're working on a monthly budget, then you just have to be thoughtful about it. But I'd say that's the biggest objection.
Thank you.
Do you have just one more question? How old can your roof be?
That's a great question. I should have thought to cover that. Our standard is 10 years at Sunbug. If it's over 10 years, then we do a visual inspection. You don't want, obviously you don't want to have to take the panels off and replace your roof. That is something we do. We have a service department, and so we can do that, but it's expensive. It's quite expensive, like maybe $5,000 to take your array off and store it and put it back up. So if it's over 10 years, then what you want to look for is is the gravel still on the roof? Are they starting to cup at all? So if they're cupping or the gravel's missing, then you really need to replace the roof first.
Thank you. And I know Ken wanted to mention the upcoming NIPS meeting, so.
Is it okay if I ask a quick question?
Oh, sure. Sorry about that.
Fine.
Didn't see.
Yeah, I had my hand raised. I didn't know. So as an environmentalist and part of the member of the sustainability group, what is the life cycle of the panels and the inverters and other equipment you need? Are they recyclable when you need to replace them? How does that work?
They are, and that's a really good question. The inverters I can't speak to. I don't know exactly what the inverters are made of and what the recycle process would be. They have copper and iron in them and some aluminum, but I don't think they have any rare earth or anything. The panels are silicon, so they do need treatment, special treatment. They're not supposed to go in a landfill. And there was just an interesting story on NPR a couple of months ago, and they were talking about this and how in Europe, where panels have been around for a longer time, they're miles ahead of us in terms of recycling solar panels. And the solar panels, you saw the graph that I presented, 20 years ago, there weren't too many solar panels installed, and they last at least 20 years. They're warranted for 20 years, and they'll be producing at 30 years, 40 years. So people aren't in any hurry to take them off the roof usually. So we really haven't gotten that flood of solar panels to be handled properly yet, and I'm hoping that they're handled properly. But all the components are recyclable. They're not hazardous. They're recyclable, but they should be separated.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
See that Dale has his hand up.
Well, my question is also about my own personal situation. I could talk with Phil about that directly, and we could go ahead and end the meeting unless you want to hear a question about adding to an array on a home, which is what I have. And I'm thinking of putting together more panels and also a carport with the idea of having an EV battery system installed.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a good question too. And I've looked at a couple of design tasks, folks who already had an array, and some of the work that you do when you put a second array up is duplicated from the first array. For instance, you still need to get another building permit. You still need another interconnection. You still need an engineering review. So there's a lot of duplicated effort. So it's probably the same cost per watt as your initial array, adjusted for, over time, the cost has gone down. I guess what I'm trying to say is that it really has to be looked at individually. And if you're talking about a reasonable sized number of panels, then it can be a good investment. If you realize that now you have room for 4 more panels and you're thinking of putting 4 more panels up, they will be very expensive. And your payback time would be very long, maybe an 18-year payback on 4 panels or something like that. Whereas a lot of the systems I look at now are 7, 8, 9-year paybacks, and sometimes less. So it all depends on the system and what your needs are. That's a pretty individualized situation.
Thank you very much. That's helpful.
Sure.
Thanks, Melanie.
Holly, you're muted. I don't mean to take over the meeting as I always do.
Are there any other questions for Phil? I don't know, Phil, I have one. I don't know if you can answer this, but if someone has no idea where to start looking for a solar installer, what is your advice?
Well, obviously they weren't tuned in tonight. Just kidding. My advice would be to find out somebody who's had solar and ask them what their experience was. There's over 200 solar companies in Massachusetts. They're not all great companies. Some of them are. There's a number of really good companies, but some of them are, some are more knowledgeable than others. But it is construction, and it is construction on your home, and it's one of the most vulnerable parts of your home, your roof. So you want it done right, and it's a big investment. So you want to make sure it's designed properly. And so if you know somebody who had a really good experience with their solar company, I think that would be a great place to start. If not, then CEC has a list of installers, who the major installers are, how many systems each of the installers has installed. What I would warn people against is sort of the gimmicky approach. If you you start Googling about solar, that you're going to start getting a lot of clickbait. And if you click that, you're going to go to a lead generating company, and that lead generating company is going to try to get as much information from you as possible and put you in touch with a solar installer. And the solar installer is not screened by their merits. They're screened by the fact that they're willing to buy those leads. And those leads are often sold to, 6 companies at once. And so it's a race who's going to get to you first. So that's not the best way to go. And there are some lead collection companies out there that seem like they have your best interest in mind. But I would suggest you could ask your local building inspector who's been installing, and don't be shy about asking for references when you do have some proposals.
Thank you. Are there any other questions before I know we've gone a little past 8, so I don't want to keep people too long.
If you'd like to share my email, Holly, and anybody has a question and it came to them later, or they didn't want to ask during the meeting, I'd be happy to, if anybody would like to email, I'd be happy to converse with them about it as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Phil. And thank you for that great presentation. And look, I just figured out how to share my screen. So I want to thank everyone for sticking with us tonight. And I don't know about you, but I learned a whole lot tonight. And we did record the meeting, so hopefully we will have it available to view again. And I did have a list of all the local organizations that joined us tonight, and we can make that available to people as well. And we have a couple of upcoming meetings. There's the Climate Working Group, which Dale Bryan leads, and that's December 13th at 7 p.m. and that's virtual via Zoom. And then the Plastics Working Group that Ken Stone leads is January 24th. I can't believe we're talking about January already, at 5:30 p.m. And you can learn more about our organization at the website, sustainableplymouth.org. And I want to thank everyone again for joining us, and we will see you next time.
Thank you so much, Phil. Thank you, Holly.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.